The White House hailed it as the dawn of a new Middle East. Israel called it the greatest advancement toward peace in the Arab world in decades. But have the agreements to normalize relations between Israel, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates sparked an arms race in the region. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. It was hailed by President Trump as a historic breakthrough. Israel and two Arab Gulf nations, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, signed bilateral agreements at the White House establishing full diplomatic relations. The so-called Abraham Accords, which were described by the US President as a significant step towards building a more peaceful, secure and prosperous Middle East, reinforced the anti-Iran axis in the Gulf region. They also paved the way for the UAE to purchase F-35 stealth fighter jets, drones, and other advanced weaponry from the United States. While Israel already flies 20 F-35s, the UAE would be the first Arab country to receive the American-made fighter jets. Some Israeli intelligence officials have voiced their concerns about the US commitment, enshrined in a 2008 law, to ensure that Israel maintains, quote, a qualitative military edge in the Middle East. Others warn that it will spark a regional arms race. So what would the US move to supply more sophisticated weapons to Gulf states mean for the stability of the wider region? One country that knows far too well the devastating impact of these weapons on its civilian population is Yemen, where the world's largest arms importer, Saudi Arabia, has been leading a bombing campaign since 2015. The International Rescue Committee calls it the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. We went to Sana'a, the largest city in Yemen, and spoke with one man who lost his 4 children in a Saudi-led coalition airstrike in Ar-Rakas last year during the holy month of Ramadan.
كنا رقود جونا احنا رقود برمضان الساعة 28 دقيقة ولا بعنا شيء راقدين ما زيدنا لا صاروا فوقنا ما شوف كل الدحدحة فوقي والتراب صيحنا ما بل الغبار والذا بس والناس يصيحوا ويبني هذاك اللي سلم ما رجع كذا اللي فوقهم يصيح أبوتي غوروا علينا قدوا ما محلقوا هذا كلهم الناس هنا بالحياة حلقوا احنا طلعوا احنا من تحت الانقاضنا والحج حقي جزحنا والعيال ما هم هنا عدهم كانوا بخرجهم لغدهم ما ادري انا مزعلان على عيالي اللي راحوا ابرياء ولا عمري شيء يعني اذا خالد كان عنده عمره 4 سنين 7 سنين عبد الرحمن عمره 10 سنين وسيم عمره 11 سنه جهال ابرياء ولا عمري شيء قولهم أمنية دحين ما بش يوم ما احنا ما نبكي شعرهم هذا المسؤول الله أعلم العدوى السعودية أنا ما بقول لهم يا أخي تطبع محمد الحين يا أخي من زمان بس من تحت الستارة يا أخي مطبعين كلهم يهود بس دحين إعلانات بالظاهر علشان يقعوا يهود كلهم ويدوا لهم سلاح والمهم احتلوا اليمن على جزيرة أكيد إنهم يعني يستعملوا السلاح هذا الجيد علشان يدمروا إحنا يزيدوا زعلان أنا والله زعلان لأنهم يتحالفوا مع يهود بالله عليك وهم عرب ومسلمين يبيعوا السلاح للسعودية تدمر إحنا بأي ذنب قتلت ليش؟ بأي سبب؟ ما في عنا ولا في عنا شيء اليمني. أنا قلق إنهم الدولة صحيح سلاح وتزيد تدمر مع باقي باليمن. العالم إنهم يبيعوا السلاح للإمارات والسعودية يدمرون الناس المساكين في اليمن.
The UAE remains actively involved in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. So how will new arms sales to the Gulf country, which is one of the top 2 US clients in the Middle East, behind Saudi Arabia, impact the region? For more on this, I'm joined by William Hartung, Director of the Arms and Security Programs at the Center for International Policy. William Hartung, we just heard those desperate calls from Yemenis to the US and other Western nations to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, the UAE and their allies in the indiscriminate bombing campaign that has been going on for 5 years in Yemen. Yet the United States administration is poised to do exactly that, sell more sophisticated and advanced weaponry to the UAE. Is this the time to be supplying more weapons to these countries? What will it mean for Yemen and for the wider region?
Well, it's absolutely the wrong time. The idea of sealing this accord with more arms sales is just going to generate an arms race in the region. I think equally importantly, the UAE has been a major player in Yemen, and I think to give them F-35s and advanced armed drones and other things in the potential package, I think will just accelerate their ability to do damage both in Yemen, in Libya, in violation of UN embargo there. So I think that element of it, I think, is deeply problematic. And of course, it will be counterbalanced by a huge package of arms to Israel.
You say that the UAE has been an active key player in the war in Yemen, yet it hasn't faced the kind of scrutiny that Saudi Arabia has. According to the Yemen Data Project, there have been almost 22,000 airstrikes in Yemen, thousands of civilians killed in airstrikes alone, a quarter of them women and children. And of course, overall, the estimates are about 126,000 Yemenis killed since the conflict began. But why hasn't the UAE faced the same level of scrutiny? And will that change?
Well, I think Saudi Arabia has been a bigger recipient of U.S. weapons, particularly combat aircraft in the past. They've taken the lead in the air war to some degree. The UAE has been very active on the ground. They've trained militias that have been involved in torture. They've transferred weapons that have ended up in the hands of both the militias, former Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula members, and also even to the Houthis. So their role, I think also, after Saudi Arabia murdered Jamal Khashoggi, the visibility of their role in Yemen in the United States was elevated substantially, both in Congress and the media. So I think those combinations, I think also the UAE and its Washington operations is somewhat more skillful in its lobbying efforts. I think they've been able to sort of polish their image in a way that the Saudis have not in recent times.
And it isn't just Yemen, is it? There's also what you have talked about as being the UAE's irresponsible conduct in Libya, where it is violating the UN arms embargo to supply arms to General Khalifa Haftar's forces against the internationally recognized government there. You say this disqualifies it from receiving any advanced combat aircraft or armed drones from the US. But those concerns haven't factored in President Trump's calculations, neither will they. Just last year, US weapons were sold to the UAE as part of an $8 billion package. Will any of that change?
Well, the Trump administration is very focused on the jobs and revenue connected to arms sales to the Gulf, and he doesn't seem like he's going to back off of that. He bragged with respect to Saudi Arabia that there were as many as 500,000 US jobs connected with those deals. In fact, it's probably a tenth of that. But he's not usually, deterred by facts. He's very much willing to exaggerate in his own political benefit. There has been efforts. Congress has several times voted to stop arms to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, only have it vetoed by President Trump. But candidate Biden has said if elected, he would cut off those arms sales. So it's in flux politically here, but certainly Donald Trump is the least likely to do anything constructive about it.
And if he does move ahead with his plans to supply the Emiratis with the F-35s that we've been hearing about, how much of a game changer will that be for the region? How will it affect Israel's qualitative military edge?
Well, that's under discussion now. There's actually kind of little committees that meet whenever the U.S. sells arms to the Middle East between the U.S. and Israel to talk about how to maintain that edge. Israel wants an additional squadron of F-35s, which costs probably $5 to $10 billion. If UAE gets them, Israel wants to have more of them. There's other things. They want attack helicopters. They want more bombs. So I think at a minimum, Israel will try to counterbalance whatever goes to the UAE by trying to get additional arms and possibly even additional military aid from the United States.
And they've already got 20 of those F-35s. In what kind of context, in what kind of conflict would Israel or the UAE or any other state in the region need those types of weapons?
Well, the fear is that it's a consolidation of an anti-Iran coalition that already existed implicitly. And so there's a danger that they might be used in a conflict with Iran. And of course, Israel over the years has tried to egg on the United States to attack Iran. They've threatened to go it alone if the US doesn't. So Netanyahu has a history of trying to foment conflict with the Iranian regime. So I think that's part of it. But I also think in the case of the UAE, they're just as likely to use the weapons elsewhere, like in Yemen or Libya. So it's a little bit of a complicated situation, but no matter how you look at it, I think it's going to make the situation worse in terms of arms racing and impacts on conflict.
You mentioned the Iran threat, or at least the specter of the Iran threat that President Trump used last year when Congress tried to block the sale of weapons for use in Yemen by both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. In a bipartisan resolution, the president vetoed the bill on the grounds that the threat from Iran constituted, quote, an emergency. Will the same happen again? Or will Congress this time go along with President Trump because of the way the normalization agreement was packaged as a, quote unquote, peace deal?
I think it's up in the air. The biggest issue in Congress has been the qualitative military edge of Israel, and there's already been a bill introduced to try to assure that that is maintained. I think there'll be some opposition to an F-35 deal. I know the UAE would like it to be notified to Congress by December, so it's already in the works before there might be a new administration. I think there will be serious debate in Congress. The kind of X factor is the elections.
And looking towards the future, you did mention the arms race in the region that this whole spate of deals could trigger. How concerned should people in the region be? Not so much, obviously, the governments, but people who live in such a volatile region, given the fact that Israel as well is also preparing to now present a new list of weaponry that it would like the Trump administration to provide it with?
Well, I think if you look at Israel's behavior in Gaza, UAE and Saudi behavior in Yemen, the kind of multifaceted arms supplies to the Syrian war, all of that sort of indicates that the last thing the region needs is more advanced weaponry pouring in. I think also to sell to the UAE at this moment represents sort of a political endorsement or a blank check for their behavior in the region. And so I think that's also a negative consequence.
What about Saudi Arabia? Obviously still hasn't formalized any deal with Israel, but we all know the advanced relationship between the country and Israel, and of course with the Trump administration. It is the world's #1 importer of weapons. How significant is that as well for the wider region?
Well, I think there's a possibility of trying to sell more weapons to Saudi Arabia as further inducement to get them to recognize Israel. And given how they've used those weapons in Yemen and been in general a reckless force in the region, I think that's a major problem.
William Hartung, Director of the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, one of the stated conditions for normalizing relations with Bahrain and the UAE was that Israel would suspend its plans to annex parts of Palestine. Yet, the US brokered accord simply called for a, quote, just, comprehensive and enduring resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, making no mention of the ongoing Israeli occupation of the state of Palestine. The Palestinian government condemned the move by Bahrain and the UAE as a stab in the back of the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people. We went to the streets of Al-Khalil in occupied Palestine to hear directly from Palestinian residents about how they view the agreement.
أكبر عار إنه الشعب العربي إنه وقف ضدنا. إحنا أصلاً بنحكي إنه الشعب العربي طول عمرنا بنوقف سندنا إنه الشعب العربي وقف مع الفلسطينيين، والأغرب إنه فجأة واحدة تطلع هذه الفجأة الفاظعة هذه بتنعاد إنه أكبر فاظعة إنه يطلع أشخاص من دول عربية يحكوا التطبيق مع إسرائيل وعارفين الاحتلال شو هو، عارفين الإسرائيليين شو هم.
هو بيحكي عن السلام بس ما له علاقة بالسلام. هي عبارة عن مرض راح يمشي لحتى يذوب القضية الفلسطينية وخاصة بالشرق الأوسط. يعني هي بتعمل على تشتيت الوحدة الوطنية والعربية، وكمان تقليص حجم القضية الفلسطينية وتقليل الاهتمام فيها.
تاع البحرين، تاع الإمارات، أنت سويت تطبيع على إيش سويت تطبيع؟ بدك تطبع مع المحتل. أنت ما عانيت منه، ما عانيت مع المحتل الإسرائيلي. الشعب الفلسطيني على مدار 70 عام عم بدفع الضريبة، عم بدافع عن عروبة الأمة الإسلامية والعربية. الشعب الفلسطيني شعب مقداد. الشعب الفلسطيني بنظر إليك، يعني أنت شو سويت له يعني في المرحلة هذه؟ عم بتطبع مع كيان إسرائيلي مغتصب لأرض فلسطين.
يتم محي الذاكرة ومحي العنوان الأساسي في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، وهو الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي، من خلال الذاكرة الجماهيرية، من خلال محي عمق الصراع الفلسطيني، ويعني تبيان للجمهور العربي وللعالم بأن الأمور تتجه بالاتجاه الإيجابي من أجل ما يسمى بمصالحة وبناء علاقات وزيارات ما بين الدولة الخائنة ودولة الاحتلال.
So have the UAE and Bahrain betrayed the Palestinian cause? And what happens next? To discuss, I'm joined by Matar Matar, a former Bahraini opposition member of parliament. He represented the Al-Wifaq party from 2010 to 2012 and was Bahrain's youngest elected MP. He resigned from parliament in protest at the Bahraini government's crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrators. Matar, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, unsurprisingly, see this decision to normalize relations with Israel as a betrayal, an abandonment of the Palestinian cause, one that only serves the interests of Israel. As a Bahraini, how do you view your government's decision to normalize ties with Israel? Do you see it as a betrayal of the Palestinians?
Yeah, we see it in the same way, and at the same time, we are not surprised. And in addition of the interests of Israelis in this deal, of course, it was a big advantage for Trump. For a country like Bahrain, when they don't care about their citizen, I doubt they will care about Palestinians. But if their focus is to make deals, I think it was a bad deals for Bahrain and UAE.
But from Bahrain's point of view, why do it now? And at the very least, should Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, two wealthy Gulf states, should they have used their leverage to extract concessions from the Israelis? There was not even a mention of the two-state solution in the Accords, only a vague mention of a, quote, just solution to the conflict.
Yeah, that's why I'm calling it a bad deal. They are talking about using their leverage to convince the Palestinians about compromises. And I doubt that the Bahrainis or the Emiratis will go in this line, because as a preparation for this deal, we saw the hate sentiment against Palestinians in the media. And when we talk about the media in a country like Bahrain, Bahrain is not a free country. We don't have a free media. So whatever we see it in the media, it's a part of a propaganda. There is a green light to spread the hate speech against the Palestinian. I don't know how can they spread the hate speech and be a moderator at the end to convince the Palestinians about anything. So it's obvious that they are putting it in a way that they would like to be as a Sunni alliance with Israelis against Iranians.
And so speaking about the green light and this Sunni alliance against Iran, would Bahrain have made such a decision without the blessing of Saudi Arabia, its large, powerful neighbor, whose political and economic support it so depends on?
Bahrain cannot take any steps without a green light from Saudis. They did this before when they did the free trade agreement with the USA. And at that time, the Saudis were not happy by Bahrain to go alone in a big deal with US without all the GCC country. That was a long time ago. The influence of Saudis and Emiratis is a huge in Bahrain. Of course, the Saudis and Emiratis are providing a big help for Bahrainis in terms of housing, in terms of huge projects, but this is coming with a price, and it seems this deal was part of the price. But
and will these deals, though, will they isolate Bahrain and the UAE from the rest of the Gulf countries, or will they lead to more quote-unquote defections? Will others follow suit? President Trump said that about, at least in his words, 5 or 6 countries would be coming along very quickly.
yeah, I doubt. For example, for Kuwait, I doubt that Kuwait will join. Possibly Oman may join, but I think Oman have a separate track. I don't think they are under influence from Saudis or Emiratis. The Qataris already started the type of relation from long time ago. So I don't think it will be something like a wave. But overall, I think this deal will make more division in the region, because from my opinion, the best way to deal with conflicts in the region is through dialogue. We see the division between Saudis and Emiratis from one side against the Qataris and against Turkey and against Iran. The best way to deal with this situation is to have a direct conversation and to treat all the disputes peacefully. Having more arms in the region, having more kind of separate deals with US. We are dealing with a strong government like US, which have a lot of leverages. They can get the maximum out of the Gulf countries with the least. So I don't think the approach of the Emiratis or Bahrainis and the Saudis is the right approach.
Yet Egypt said the 2 agreements would help, quote, establish stability and peace in the region. Iran, on the other hand, said that Bahrain is now, quote, a partner to the crimes of Israel. Another major regional player that you mentioned, Turkey, was forceful in its condemnation of Bahrain's deal with Israel, saying it will encourage Israel's efforts to make the occupation of Palestinian lands permanent. How likely is that to happen now that this normalization has come about? 2 countries, yes, but there are more potentially in the offing, and the Palestinians have been left out of the equation. The only real goal seems to be the weakening of Iran.
Yeah, from this side, I don't think it have really a major impact on the ground. The relation between Bahrain, UAE with Israel is from long time ago. They were getting everything they want without announcing a diplomatic relation. So I don't think this really a big deal. It's something for Trump to use in his election, but on the ground, the situation with the settlement and with the invasion, the Palestinians are really in a very tough situation. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain, they were having the opportunities to help the Palestinians. They didn't do that from a long time ago. Now they are using, as I said, the hate sentiment against the Palestinians as if something new happening by the Palestinians. Nothing changed by Palestinians and their rhetoric and their demands. We hear they are talking about the corruption. I don't see anything new on this aspect there in Palestine, but it's obvious that it's the propaganda to spread it this time.
All right, we'll see what happens next. Matar Matar, former member of the Bahraini parliament, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
While the United States and its regional allies continue to package the so-called Abraham Accords as a historic step towards peace and prosperity in the Middle East, there is little doubt what they represent for Palestinians: the unraveling of an already deeply fractured Arab front and 2 new Arab betrayals of their cause, and a further disincentive for Israel to sit at the table with more Arab defections in the offing since Egypt's historic one in 1979. But beyond the Palestinian cause, these new diplomatic recognitions of Israel not only cement the end of an already moribund Arab League, they crystallize the shifting geopolitical reality of the region: Gulf states led by Israel against their arch-enemy Iran, and an arms race with greater risks of hot wars for everyone in the region. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.